Audience members, I want to start by asking you to please silence your electronic devices. For those presenting today, please turn your mic on when you begin speaking and off when you've completed your remarks. For all presenters, please state your name for the record before speaking or responding to questions. Our briefing today is on the Preschool for All True Cost of Care briefing from the Preschool and Early Learning Division. I want to thank everyone who's here to present on this today. This is a really important presentation to understand the true costs for our providers in our Preschool for All program. We've spent a lot of time this past year talking about the transformational value of this program to our families, the children in our care, and our economy, but it's important to remember the people who make it all possible. These are our providers, our teachers, our school staff, most of whom are women and women of color, whose labor and contributions have for so long been undervalued by our society. That's why from the very inception of the program, in those meetings I was having with parents, educators, and advocates, Preschool for All was designed with a strong commitment to supporting our providers and providing a living wage to our early education workforce. In that way, the program has not just been a powerful force for good, it has also been a force for justice. A true cost of care study will further our goals here. I want to thank Commissioners Moyer and Brim-Edwards for introducing the resolution requiring the Department of Human Services, Preschool and Early Learning Division to conduct this study. The study was also endorsed by both the PFA TAG and PAG. Since then, our DCHS Director, Rachel Pearl, and the Preschool and Early Learning Division Director, Denise McLean, have partnered with the Prenatal to 5 fiscal strategies to review information from collected surveys, provider interviews, focus groups, advisory bodies, preschool and early learning, and national sources to inform the final cost projections. This data, along with feedback from this board, are key to informing the development of a true operating cost fiscal modeling, which the preschool and early learning team will work with the county's budget office to develop. The goal is to have this tool, as well as a report, completed by August 2026 in time for a vote to determine any potential changes to the PFA tax mechanism. This modeling tool will be presented to the board during the PFA work session scheduled for July 21st, 2026. Overall, compared with other universal preschool initiatives, Preschool for All has taken the time and thoughtfulness required that puts us ahead of other programs who have gone through similar evaluations to what we will learn today. In order to have the best universal preschool system in the country, you need to invest in the people who make it happen. As the Preschool for All program continues expansion to universality, information like what we hear today will be helpful for this board as we deliberate on program policies this summer. And I want to turn it over now to Commissioners Moyer and Brim-Edwards to add their opening remarks.
Thank you so much. Very excited for today's presentation. And wanted to talk about where we are in our process for using this tool and what it allows us, the conversations that it allows us to have. First and foremost, true cost of care modeling allows us the ability to see how policy decisions we make pencil out in real time and real dollars. Which is something that is a real gift in policymaking. So often we are looking at really consequential policy options without being able to look at this level of detail. So what I'm excited about with this work is the possibilities for us to be able to use it as the dynamic tool that it is designed to be. It does not tell us how much the entire Preschool for All program costs. That's not what this tool is. What this tool is it allows us to look at our policies, look at our programs, how we operate now, what policy options are in front of us, and it allows us to understand the cost implications for those policies. And I think that's important because I never want to say that something is something it is not, but I also want to be so excited about what it is we're getting, because this is not a one-off study with a one-time number that becomes dated and irrelevant. It is, in fact, a tool we can go back to over and over again as this program moves forward, as new challenges and opportunities avail themselves. We get to work with this tool and say, okay, what would happen if we did this? If we could do something like pooling health insurance and it control, cost growth, what does that do to the program over 10 years? If we invested in helping teachers achieve higher education, what would that do to the system? It's such a dynamic instrument. So I'm not just excited about what we're going to learn today, but I'm really very excited about how we get to engage with the Preschool for All policies in a way that lets us understand the dynamics and how we can steward this program forward, meeting our goals in a financially responsible way. And so I am excited that today we get the opportunity to learn about the foundational work that is building this tool, but we also get to give our input as to what are some of the dynamics we're interested in exploring and using this tool to do. Because it is going to be with us, hopefully, for the long term, enable to have us be as transparent and accurate with the public as we tackle significant issues. What does 0 to 3 look like with a Preschool for All program? How do we make sure that teachers are being retained? There are many things that we can now play out, different scenarios that will allow us to understand the financial implications of that work. So I'm so excited for not just today, but I'm really excited to have this tool moving forward so that we can implement the most effective and impactful Preschool for All program for Multnomah County. So I'll turn this over to Commissioner Medwards.
Thank you for the partnership, Commissioner Moyer, and I also want to thank the partnership of the Preschool and Early Learning Division and the department staff to get us here to today. I view this study and model as part of the continuing evolution of universal preschool in Multnomah County. I'm looking forward to today hearing how this new tool may help us better assess the overall costs of the county's universal preschool program and what the cost is to individual providers, since students have different needs and sometimes there are costs associated with that, both for providers and the implication for the overall costs, and many of the things that Commissioner Moyer shared this morning. So having additional tools to evaluate different weighted costs will help us better address the unique needs of preschoolers, and they should be sort of at the center of our decision making, and allow us to do that in a more dynamic way with this preschool program. If you combine this tool with the fresh demographic study, along with the gap analysis that we know is also going to be coming to the commission, we'll have a better ability to understand what universal means in Multnomah County. We'll have a much better sense of the cost of the program, which will allow us to be better financial stewards and also better support the program. I just want to flag that the materials we received today, if any people are looking at them or look at them after the meeting, they'll see that it's a presentation, not the final draft report with the tool, so that we don't have the supporting data or the assumptions, the weighted criteria, or necessarily the considerations in the written presentation today. We'll need to get that as part of our work, but also today's session and this commission's direction on a number of different elements of our universal preschool program will help us get to that sort of final tool. So I'm looking forward to getting more of the supporting data and the assumptions that underlined today's presentation. And with that, I just want to again thank Commissioner Moore and the department for the partnership and leadership in this work. I'm looking forward to today's briefing, and thank you, Chair, for your work as well.
Thank you so much. All right, so I'd like to hand it over to our DCHS Director, Rachel Pearl, and our PEL Director, Denise McLean. And also welcome our partners from Prenatal to 5 Fiscal Strategies. Thank you guys so much for being here. We're really looking forward to this presentation. Good morning.
Thanks, Chair. We're looking forward to it too. Good morning, everyone. My name is Rachel Pearl, she, her pronouns. I'm the Director for Department of County Human Services, and we are here today in partnership with our Prenatal to 5 Fiscal Strategies partners to present some preliminary information from the True Cost of Care study that DCHS and Preschool and Early Learning Division contracted with them to provide. In our conversations with Simon and Gina, who we are very grateful to have traveled here and to join us today, I was pleased to learn that unlike what was reported in some local media outlets, our rates really are not that far off from true cost, which really is on track with the intentionality of the preschool and early learning team in the implementation of this program. So I feel really great about that as they've shared what they've discovered in other studies, and so we're in a good place. But that being said, we still have work to do. And the study will provide us with a tool, I think much to what Moira was speaking to, and Commissioner Brim-Edwards as well, that we can use into the future to ensure that our model and our rates remain responsive, accurate, and supportive of our providers' operational realities, and in turn allow us to continue building a sustainable universal preschool program for Multnomah County. I look forward to their presentation this morning and the chance to walk through their initial findings and hearing your questions and feedback that can be incorporated into the final version of the tool and how we move forward. So this is a conversation, and this is a really important stage in this process because your voice and feedback is going to be really, really important to us. So I will pass it to Denisa to ground us in some background behind the study, and we'll get started.
Good morning, Chair. Good morning, Commissioners. My name is Denisa McLean. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the Division Director for the Preschool and Early Learning Division. I'd like to just start out with grounding us in some context. Sorry, Tasia, next slide. Should have said that before. Ground us in some context. A bit of history that what got us here today. Essentially, we worked to connect the Preschool for All plan language and the language that was written in the ballot measure. The plan details expectations around salary and connects it back to degree attainment as well as the Oregon Registry levels, step levels. Expectations contained requirements for the initial start of the Preschool for All program, as well as attainment levels as the program reaches maturity in 2030. In addition, the Preschool for All plan details a number of features to ensure program quality, and those include staff competencies, professional development, coaching, and paid time, as well as expectations around the early learning environment itself. And as a reminder, the Preschool for All plan was written and developed in order to align with the Preschool Promise and our Oregon prenatal to kindergarten structure within Oregon State. We wanted to ensure that we built a publicly funded program that aligns with the rest of the publicly funded programs that Multnomah County families have access to as well. All of these details have an attached cost to them. PL utilizes a per slot allocation approach, primarily driven by salary rates set each year. The per seat cost allocation is different for each setting type. So we've got school day, school year, and then we also have full day, full year. The allocation amount is updated each year. PEL allocates additional funding for eligible providers beyond the seat cost. So we also support transportation, infant toddler wage stabilization, as well as inclusion funding. In recent years, the Preschool for All received feedback related to the cost implementation for Preschool for All and expectations for the full day program that may potentially exceed the cost allocated amount. Members from the Technical Advisory Group recommended that the Preschool and Early Learning Division commission a true cost of care study to really determine whether the PEL's seat cost or seat allocations were sufficient enough in implementing the program as it is designed. In February 2026, PEL contracted Prenatal to 5 Fiscal Strategies to commission a true cost of care study. And the goal was to determine its implementation and the actual cost it takes to be able to implement Preschool for All in its entirety as it is designed. We wanted to also better understand the cost and the varying setting types for preschool services, And of course, a key question that we had wonderings around was around inclusive care and the ability to provide inclusive care, a cost associated for the inclusive opportunities for all children. Next slide, Tasia. So here we are today, and selecting our organization to conduct this study, it was incredibly important to us that we were grounded in the work that utilized real data and a mixed delivery method. P5 Fiscal Strategies has conducted similar studies with the state of Oregon for their preschool promise. So we were able to, that allows us to have a model that aligns closely with the state. We also had close relationships with the researchers who partnered with P5 in their work and heard how collaborative, thorough, and high quality that their work was. And our experience has been exactly that. We are grateful for your partnership, and we look forward for the conversations today and appreciate the opportunity for the commission and our chair to journey with us as we continue to develop these opportunities and understand the real true cost of what it takes to implement a stable preschool for all program. And now I will pass it to our partners at P5.
Good morning. Thanks for being here.
Morning. My name is Gina Capito with Prenatal to 5 Fiscal Strategies. Thank you for having us. I realize that we have to switch decks, so I'll give you a second to move us. I'm going to start us out with a little bit of framing of what we're hoping to achieve in the working session, which echoes much of what the chair and the commissioners have already framed, as well as the department staff around the point in time we are and how excited we are to be in this opportunity to be working together on thinking about your preschool for all system. I am also pleased to be here with you again. I believe I was probably a very large head on that screen last August talking about the idea of true cost of care studies. So seeing it live and in person of probably how large my Zoom window was, it's a little disconcerting. So much more pleased to be here in person for this discussion. Part of what we are going to do today is talk about initial findings, and that is the key piece of when we think about a study. But I think it's also important for us to begin framing that this is also an approach, using a cost-based approach to understanding your service delivery, and that having a tool like a cost model, which is a key piece of your study, makes it more of an ongoing functional relationship with that tool that is more than just a printed report. And I think that's a key piece of the grounding and sort of foundation that we're setting with this particular working session. So we are going to talk a little bit about where we are in the true cost of care process. We are going to talk a little bit about why cost and why cost models, because that is key to that foundation of how you use the tool in an ongoing way. We're going to talk more about the Multnomah County model in particular and how we got to the model that has, as it exists right now. And then we're going to talk about those findings and what those findings are showing us right now and what the opportunities are for potentially running different scenarios and getting different findings out of the model. I'll do just a quick intro if we go ahead to the next slide for Prenatal to 5 Fiscal Strategies, because our colleagues at the department were so complimentary. And Simon and I just wanted to highlight that we have, in addition to working in Oregon deeply and for many years now, also have a lot of experience at both local and state levels and in combination in states where there's local level work going on and then also state level work. So we understand that sort of connection. And frankly, we built Prenatal to 5 Fiscal Strategies, launched it for exactly this sort of moment, this idea of local investments, acknowledging that how do we address quality and access and what we want for families of young children, and what does it cost? How do we do it? How do we sustain it? How do we plan for it and ensure that all of the necessary supports are in place, which fundamentally will include some system change, not just having the answers to what does it cost. We have to put those things together. And that's why we built the organization, to be able to be this sort of support for community leaders in engaging in these efforts. I do want to take a moment and allow Simon to introduce himself as a fellow co-founder and principal.
Thanks, Gina. So I'm Simon Workman, co-founder and principal of Prenatal to 5 Fiscal Strategies, and thank you to the chair and the commissioners for having us here today.
So ours is a very relationship-based approach. It warms our heart to hear that you heard good things from others that we've worked with, especially the idea that we are responsive. And we really do sit alongside and work deeply with, because building a model, answering the question of what does something cost, how much money do you have? Those are all things that could happen in isolation of the constituents and leaders who are going to use it, but that's not something that is then particularly useful on the ground. That's our experience, and that's why we do this work different. It could at times mean that it takes a little bit longer, though we did work on a pretty aggressive schedule with this particular process. And if we go ahead to the next slide, I'll kind of give an outline of how that relationship-based approach, how it comes to fruition in a cost of care study / cost model development process. We really see them, particularly when you are building a cost model as part of your study, that they are interchangeable. The concepts are interchangeable. We carry out the same key components. We work really closely with various constituents in the community or state. That can be the staff at the entity that's administering the funds. It's certainly the programs and providers who are receiving the dollars and administering the services, elected officials such as yourselves. These are all key audiences for our engagement, which at times can mean that it takes a little longer. It means more meetings. It means working together on what are we trying to achieve? How do we need the model to function to meet your needs? As Commissioner mentioned, models are dynamic, but what is key to them as they get built to be dynamic is that they're reflective of what you need it to do. Your model is not the same as Alameda's model or the state of New Mexico's cost model. Your model reflects the delivery of PFA. It also does weave into it best practice from those learnings across the country, as well as what we hear from the input gathering, the data collection, research on the regulations and the things that are already in place within your funding initiative and what you're trying to achieve, all being folded together into the tool. So that's a key piece of how the work takes place and how long it can take. As far as where we are in this particular point in time, we really are in the purple and beginning to lead into the gray last two rows, but you see that we're not in a completed process. We are in an iterative process where more input is being gathered. Running scenarios and then thinking about those outputs in relationship to policy choices and rate setting that can be informed by the model can take many months of going back and forth and really thinking about what are we trying to achieve and what does the cost model tell us as a number and how does that affect the bottom line of what we can afford and when we can afford it. Is it something we can do in the next fiscal year, or is it a 2 or 3 year out process? Those are all things that become part of that iterative process of what, under a big category of running scenarios, is actually a lot of nuanced work and changing of assumptions in the cost model. So with that iterative process, we really appreciate this opportunity to engage in the working session and kind of really think about what it is that you need out of your model and how we got to a tool that helps to meet those needs. So moving forward to the next slide, I want to take us into this idea of why a cost-based approach, because part of what we do need to acknowledge when we think about where the providers and where the field that delivers early care and education is coming from is sort of the reality of their status quo. In the case of many providers within this system, if they have taken public funding to support their delivery of services, they have received public funding that has come from information on what families can afford to pay in tuition. This is going to, and we're going to talk about it a few times here over the next couple of slides, but this becomes a critical piece of grounding in how we got to where we are with the way services are delivered to young children. And when you're working on a disruption, in the most positive of ways, disruption, like your universal preschool program is, knowing where the entities that deliver the service are and where they're coming from, many of them 20 to 30 years of history of an approach, is really important to the success of that disruption, because this is different. This is a game changer in the best possible way again, but well, acknowledge that there are people running programs, many women and families running programs that have had experience for years of a very different approach to the work. And so we need to kind of be thinking about that as we think about cost models. And as we think about how we ensure that they kind of take us from where we are to where we want to go and where our initiative is taking us. And that sort of takes us to this idea of some of the key concepts. So going ahead to the next slide, there's sort of 3 key concepts. The first one, and some of this content will be familiar from when I joined you in August of 2025, because this is some of the basics. These are key concepts around understanding where our field has come from and how we make change and where we're going, especially as we invest new dollars into it. That first concept of price is that piece of provider experience over many decades of what publicly funded, subsidized support for childcare, how it was established as a rate to pay, and that price was in essence what that rate to pay was. In theory, the idea of what a family could pay for care is certainly not a bad concept to understand then what should the public entity pay. But if families cannot afford the cost of the service, then we have an inherent disconnect. We have something that we believe is the actual cost of the service when really what it is what a provider is charging a family. It is not what the provider is experiencing as cost. And so one way to think about it is it's what the market can bear, because the market is families that are out purchasing the care. And in that instance, providers, if your goal is to provide home-based or center-based services to families in your community, and you know that the income of those families will not allow them to cover the full cost of the service you're offering, you have a choice there. You either lower your tuition or keep your tuition at that lower point that a family can afford, or you stop delivering the service. In the case of the way our industry has worked for many, many years, that information on what the market can bear or what families could pay was then utilized by public partners, primarily those responsible for administering federal dollars into our communities, to set the public subsidy rate that pays for childcare. So we took something that was about what a family could pay for care and turned it into basically a policy. We turned it into the payment policy, unfortunately with that disconnect that what a family can pay not being what it actually costs a provider has had a significant ripple across operations for many years. And it takes us to that next concept, the concept of cost. And in future sort of perfect world, at some point, the cost that providers are incurring would be able to be related to us as the external entities that are working with them to develop cost models, and it would reflect the true cost of the program. We are not at that point yet, because providers have spent, again, for many providers, more than 2 decades operating under public funding that did not cover their cost. So they had to make operating choices to be able to keep their doors open, to be able to balance their budget to sort of the best of their abilities. And so when we talk to providers right now about their expenses, we get the actual expenses a program incurs, but it is not the true cost of what the program needs to operate. It includes choice points like not hiring as many teaching staff as they need to cover the classroom, and instead administrators like directors or assistant directors spend part of their time in the classroom, even though they also have a full-time responsibility as management of the program. It includes not offering discretionary benefits like health insurance to any of their employees because they can't cover the cost of it, or offering it and not paying for any portion of it, which if we've all paid for health insurance, we know that paying it full freight is a non-starter when you make maybe $15 an hour. There's other choices that programs have made around the quality of the materials and the other things they deliver to families, or they've scaled things back. We used to do this for families. We used to have parent nights. We hear that all the time from providers. And that's where, when we do modeling and we think about the idea of a cost-informed approach, it's very important that we don't just stop at cost coming from providers at this point in time. As we shift this system and we make that positive disruption, there could be a point in time where the cost that providers relate to us is equal to the true cost. We are not there yet because of this long history of scarcity in the payment rates and how much that impacted operational choices. Which is why it's very important that when we build cost models, and why a modeling tool is so much more useful for an initiative like yours than a cost study or a point-in-time analysis of cost, is the modeling tool includes those concepts of true cost, salary goals or a salary scale established by your community around what a quality staff should earn as their wages, what full compensation looks like when folks also earn the discretionary benefits and time off that they deserve for the work that they do. These things around true cost can reflect, and do, as Simon's going to be taking us in to talk a little bit about the deep dive into research that we did around Preschool for All, can reflect the regulations and the components and the values that you've embedded in your Preschool for All program and translate them into cost outputs. Understand what is the cost driver behind those and help us build that true cost reflective of your program, and then you have a model that is able to generate you outputs that help you understand that. So this is sort of a key concept around what it goes into cost models. So if we take a quick look at the next slide, it just is sort of another way to reinforce this concept around the idea of moving from a market rate informed approach to a cost-based informed. So if we go ahead to the next slide. Some of the same things are here, so I'm going to go quickly on this one, but what this does is reinforce the idea of the sources that are informing you when you're making decisions. Rate setting, especially if you leverage the Oregon state rates related to subsidized care, were very much in that market rate approach. Even if you modified them, they had a basis of a market rate approach, because that's what the state of Oregon has been using for the subsidized care rates. The cost-based approach in building a cost model has many different sources of data, and those flow in together and give you more options for understanding the cost. Status quo, current cost, but also true cost of care, as I mentioned. And Simon's going to talk a little bit more about some of those different sources that we are able to access, and some of the additional data collection that we did as part of the last few months of work with your community, and how important those sources of data were to building your cost model and informing it. One of the key things that then we can move to is what is a cost model itself. With this approach in mind and the idea of the data in mind, sort of what is a cost model and what does it support us to do? And so we'll go to the next slide with just pivoting into more of a cost modeling overview. We kind of discussed the why. The why because public revenue has not been informed by cost, yet has been making the decision around how much a provider makes. We need to move to having a resource that supports us to understand what the cost should be and what the cost would be when we do things like increase salaries for staff. If you do only a cost study, as I mentioned, you have a static output. You have a single number. When you do a cost model, you have an interactive tool that will then, by its nature, give you different answers depending on the questions that you ask it, which is going to become clearer as we go forward here to get together. A couple things that we like to underscore. There are a lot of different variables that models allow you to understand the cost of, whether a program meets only licensing, do they meet the regulations of PFA, higher quality, different salary points. Those sorts of variables are key into place. Also understanding different settings, a family child care cost versus a center-based cost. Different ages of children have different costs to deliver the service to them. All of those pieces come into play in how models work, and that's key to informing policy and your funding choices that you're making. But one thing that we want to be clear on is that this is not every program's budget. It's not actually any program's budget, it's a model, but it will help to inform, and because it is seeking to encompass all of the expenses for a program based on the choices that you make in using the tool, it gives the resources necessary for a program to operate and build their budget and operate under the regulations that they're held to, the salary scale that they're held to. It still remains that it gives programs some flexibility for choices that we want programs to have, but it encompasses all of the pieces that are critical, like the salaries and the quality measures, and ensuring that you understand how much those cost to deliver, so you've put forward a rate that encompasses those expenses and allows a provider to be able to meet those regulations, to be able to achieve those salary points. So let's move to more of the what is it, and what is a cost model. Basics, it is a tool. I think we've kind of mentioned that a few times, that it is a tool. It's an interactive tool, which means that there is not going to be a single answer out of the tool. It also means that you will not necessarily get the same answer. If Commissioner Singleton and I both use the tool and we ask different questions of it, use different salary scales, for instance, we're going to get two different sets of outputs from the model. It doesn't mean that either of us did anything wrong. It means that we were using the model, answering one set of questions in my case and another set of questions in the commissioner's case, and that's intentional. That's why it's so important, and that's sort of the stage we're in with this particular working session, is to have a conversation around, we've ran some initial questions in the model and gotten some initial outputs. Are those the right choices in the model for where you're going next? That's why this idea of an iterative process versus just a sort of complete study that's done without engagement is where we are as a process, because you can see there's many different things that you get to choose, and as we're going to talk about some of the data that went into the tool, that will become even clearer as we then lead into looking at the outputs together. So we're going to go back to process now and start talking about how the Preschool for All model itself was built. So I'll turn it to Simon.
Thank you, Gina. Once again, I'm Simon Workman with Prenatal to 5 Fiscal Strategies, and thank you for having us here. We can go ahead a couple of slides, please. Yeah, thank you. So as Gina said, we're now going to talk about actually the Preschool for All model. You've got some of the background there from Gina on the sort of process that we've gone through, but as you heard, we did a lot of engagement with the community, a lot of looking at data, and so we want to share with you sort of all of the process that went into getting the model together. So if we go to the next slide. So as has been mentioned a couple of times, we have an established methodology that we've developed at Prenatal to 5 Fiscal Strategies for cost modeling, which has been used in many jurisdictions to actually both understand the cost of care for advocacy purposes, for policy planning purposes, but also to use it to directly set those payment rates. And across all of this work, we have spent a lot of time surveying providers, looking at data, to develop this methodology, which has now been used by pretty much all of the states that use cost modeling to set CCDF funding, as well as by the Federal Office of Childcare as part of their cost modeling tool. So a lot of the basis of the model that we developed for Preschool for All is informed by that decade or more of modeling and experience of talking to providers and looking at data across multiple jurisdictions. Obviously, it has been completely customized for the Preschool for All context, and starting from our Oregon experience and our context in Oregon, as has been mentioned a couple of times, we've been working in Oregon on childcare cost modeling since about 2019. And continuing to currently work with the Department for Early Learning and Care on an update to that cost model. We actually first started working with them when they were the learning division, and the first model was actually informed by a statewide survey of over 1,000 respondents across the state, as well as an expert work group and input sessions and focus groups and interviews, and a lot of review of extant data sources around salaries and non-personal expenses. Over the last few years, we've been updating the model, making sure it's current. And so then when we were engaged to create this model for the Preschool for All, we were able to say, okay, we're going to start from this base so that we know that the modeling is meeting the state licensing standards, because all your providers, kind of use that as a base of where they're starting. And it also ensures there is this alignment so that, your providers are not operating in a silo. They are operating within this community, but they also often taking Preschool for All. Taking Preschool Promise or Baby Promise, or taking the ERDC, Employment-Related Daycare subsidy. And so they are meeting multiple standards, they are meeting multiple requirements. And so the model ensures that it can account for all of those different things. So if we go to the next slide, as I said, we're using that the statewide model, the DELC model, as a starting point, but we did make a lot of modifications to make sure that the model is aligned with the Preschool for All standards and with some of the specific expenses within Multnomah County. The statewide model has some ability for regionalization, but Multnomah County is part of a larger region that is sort of the whole state subsidy region A, and so we wanted to be able to make sure we could go really deep into exactly what the expenses are here in Multnomah, especially thinking about some of the expenses on the non-personnel side, as well as the specific expenses related to Preschool for All. And in order to do that, we did a lot of engagement with providers. We hosted input sessions, which we'll talk a bit more about in a moment, as well as conducted some direct one-to-one interviews to get input from PFA providers. We also engaged in a lot of research, looking at data that had already been collected. There's a lot of data that the PL team has already collected around salaries, workforce step levels, program enrollment numbers, characteristics of programs, et cetera, which enabled us to access a lot of data about all of your providers without having to burden providers with yet another survey. We hear a lot in the field that providers are really busy, and being asked to engage in more and more research can somewhat be burdensome. So as much as possible, we will look at the data that currently exists. Of course, within the whole cost modeling process, there are a lot of assumptions that have to be made, decisions that have to be made. If you think back to what Gina was sharing about true cost, a lot of that is not currently happening. So it isn't a direct of like, what are you doing, put that in the model. There's a lot of, well, what would it take to do this? And so that requires a lot of discussion and assumptions. And as much as Gina and I have a lot of expertise doing this, we always want to make sure it's informed by local leadership and local data as well. So we had lots of meetings with the PEL team and different members of the team to understand actually how standards were being applied in practice and understand some of those additional operations. And obviously, as part of that continued model development is this meeting today, being able to talk to you and get your input and feedback on some of the assumptions as well, so that before we finalize the model, before we finalize the study, everyone has a chance to weigh in. So I do want to take a couple of moments just to talk about some of the data that went into the model. As Commissioner Brim-Edwards noted, this is a presentation and there is a report that will come alongside this. We sort of made sure we understood there were some time constraints and wanted to make sure we could get you some initial results today, but there will be a full report that details all of the data and assumptions, and we're always happy to meet with anybody to go over those directly as well. So if we go to the next slide, here is a summary of the sort of main quantitative data that goes into the model. We did receive data from the department with information on all of the current salaries of the workforce within PFA programs and the step level, the educational step levels. And that was over 1,398 staff members were included in there, with over about 170 providers. This is data from fall of 2025. There is some sort of data coming out hot off the press around this time, but the fall 2025 data is what we had access to use. But so that is almost 1,400 data points on staff members that are included to inform what you'll see in the results around current salaries and current compensation levels and aligned with credentials. And so, as I said, that allowed us to, across those two areas, which is often an area we would have to survey providers on, we were able to access that data through the administrative data that already exist. We, of course, reviewed all the state licensing requirements because we know all PFA providers have to meet those. While the state model theoretically had all those included, we wanted to make sure that nothing had changed and everything was included, as well as looking at the PFA program standards. And this is really where we're looking at, what are the cost drivers? What are the things you're asking providers to do that have a cost related to them? Some of them are very direct, like what are your ratio and group size requirements? You have pay requirements, right? There's a very detailed requirements, are very sort of simple to map them on. There are other things around family engagement, around how are you providing a welcoming environment, how are you providing a culturally responsive environment. Some of those other things require some additional, obviously, insight from providers to sort of understand how they are actually done in practice and what are the costs that are associated with them. One of the other big things about the model, and you saw this on the slide Gina shared about not getting a single answer from the model, is the costs look different if you are a 200-300 child program with multiple ages than if you're a small family childcare home with 10 children, right? There's clearly a big difference in there. And even within that, understanding just how many children are in programs, what the characteristics of programs that are in the PFA system right now are, that was data that was also accessed and integrated into here. And then finally, obviously, some of the non-personnel expenses, which are a smaller part of the overall budget of a provider, but are still important and are a key way to actually be able to customize the model for the county. We really looked at what are the significant non-personnel expenses that are going to be different. So, adjusting the rent, mortgage, occupancy expenses to account for the higher cost of living that could be here. We've heard a lot from providers about the increase in child liability insurance and the costs of that. We were able to access some data that a partner organization of ours, First Children's Finance, had collected through surveys of Multnomah County providers on what they pay in child liability insurance. So that was a key data point that we were able to reflect what we heard from providers about that's an expense that's gone up, and actually have some hard data from a survey that had been completed amongst preschool providers here in the county. So all that's to sort of show you the model is informed by a lot of data and a lot of data that's very specific to multnomah. But as I said, it's also really important to make sure that we are talking to providers and seeing how things work in practice. And so that's why we also engaged in qualitative data. So if we go to the next slide, this is a summary of that process that we did for that. We set up a series of what we call input sessions, which are essentially sort of small focus groups with about 10 to 15 providers at a time, to be able to share with us a little more beyond what the data might say on its own, right? Telling us actually how it looks to meet the PFA requirements, any challenges they might face, barriers they might face, things that are working well that we want to make sure are sort of replicated in the model amongst those providers who are able to sort of make it work with the resources they have. Understanding the hours they work, if there's an administrative burden to being part of PFA, meaning the PFA requirements, really understanding what that looks like in terms of a time. So we held these input sessions. They are targeted to sort of directors, fiscal managers, family childcare home provider owners, sort of the people who sort of know the operations of the program. We hosted them at multiple times of the day and the week and in multiple languages to make sure that all types of providers could attend. So, family childcare providers who wanted to attend on a weekend or an evening, we had them led in English and Spanish, although we had offered other languages as well. And we also offered direct interviews for anyone who would rather just do a one-on-one or had a very sort of complex program that they wanted to talk about, as well as with school districts. We conducted interviews with several of the school districts in the county to understand how they're implementing the program as well. So in total, we ran 13 input sessions. We conducted 8 interviews. Across all of those, we had direct input from 65 PFA providers. And that was in addition to then those 1,400 data points I mentioned on the prior slide that sort of all came together to inform the model. And just on the next slide, I wanted to provide a little bit of a summary of some of that feedback that we heard, which is likely not feedback that that would surprise you and that you haven't heard before. But we did receive a lot of very positive feedback on the existence of Preschool for All and the benefit it has been for programs themselves, for their financial stability, and for families. And I think it's important to point that out. We do this work all across the country, and often the input sessions can be very negative because they can be very much focused on how underfunded the system is because the system is broken in a lot of places. Clearly, the existence of the Preschool for All program has been a huge benefit to a lot of providers, and I think it's really important that that we sort of share that feedback back with you. A lot of gratitude for the workforce and program supports. Clearly, lots of people using the coaching, the inclusion supports, translation, interpretation services, etc. So we heard a lot of great things, and so I do want to make sure that is on the record as well. In terms of sort of additional areas where programs talked about additional needs or additional costs they were facing, a lot of it related to time. We all would like more time. PFA providers were not unique there. But thinking about some of the administrative time that they have to do beyond the direct service, planning, addressing the staffing needs that a lot of them face, coordinating with the PEL staff to keep up with requirements and reporting, making sure you're keeping up with the changing PFA standards. And also, as I mentioned earlier, these programs exist within a larger system. So, coordinating across the multiple funding streams and enrollment systems. And this goes to that point of true cost. So in our true cost model, we try and address this by actually having robust staffing. The way programs are making it work right now is the sort of directors are often doing a lot of this administration beyond their regular sort of 40 hours a week. And then other things, the increased cost of liability insurance we heard a lot about, increased needs of children, especially behavioral concerns, especially sort of in a post-COVID world. We're hearing that there's a lot of need for additional support for children, which sort of somewhat related, there's a lot of educator burnout and turnover, which some of that is related to pay, but some of it is just also related to, this is a hard job, and especially when you're dealing with children with additional needs, there can be that additional sort of burnout. And then, looking at the pay increases and sort of, we did hear from providers talking about those required pay increases and the impact of if you go up in a higher step level, which we all want educators to do to get higher credentials and to continually be improving their practice, that you then need to be paying them more, but there's not necessarily more funding to pay them, and sort of the challenge of sort of keeping up with that. And so all of that data all comes together into the actual cost model. And as I said, all of this will be detailed in much more specific ways in the report. But now I'm going to turn it back to Gina to sort of talk about how we actually then used all of this in the cost model.
So go ahead, take me 2 slides forward, and we're going to jump into just a few specifics of how the model functions and what some of the choices that are key to the outputs we're going to look at today are. So a little bit of grounding on the basics of model functioning before we see the outputs, which are annual cost per child values. But it's sort of key to be clear when you see those values that there's certain key features of them, and those are that it includes the full cost of operating translated into an annual cost per child output. We spend a lot of time talking about salaries because salaries makes up a lot of the largest percentage of the cost of the service for young children, but that doesn't mean that the model doesn't include all of the non-personnel that come along with running a child care program. And you see a breakdown of the different categories. We have actually over 30 different line items in the non-personnel, and they roll up to those categories that you see on the slide. So you see some examples of what those non-personnel values are. The way the model works is that in basically all instances, there's some cost driver or unit, and often it's a unit of the amount per child for like a non-personnel amount, and then depending on the number of children that you're modeling, that you're running your output on, that will go up or down. So if you have 10 children in a family childcare, the food for those 10 children gets multiplied 10 by the food cost. If you have 68 children, in the case of a center, obviously your food costs are going to be different. So that's just a little basics on the fact that the model is always including all of these things, even if when we're getting in the weeds on some of your policy choices, we spend a lot of time talking about things like the PFA regs and the salary scale, because those are 2 of the biggest cost drivers. The model does include all ages of children from birth to school age. You can run different iterations. To Simon's point, a program that serves children from birth to school age versus a program that only serves children from birth to 3 is going to see different costs as well because of the nature of the different ratio and group sizes that come with different ages of children. There is 2 models inherent to the tool, one for centers and one for family childcares, because family childcare is a different type of service delivery than a center, and so there's different features. The same fundamental foundation of a cost approach, but there are different staffing patterns and approaches to delivering the care in those 2 settings. It includes all of your mandatory taxes and coverage for breaks required under sort of employment law, if you kind of think about it that way. It also includes any cost drivers related to meeting basic health and safety under licensing. You cannot run a scenario in any of our models where you don't meet basic health and safety. While there's a lot you can turn on, you can always do better than meeting licensing, we do not build models that don't meet basic state licensing laws. And then different salary selections and workforce step levels. These are all some of the choices that you have in the tool. What we wanted to highlight before we start looking at those outputs is how, and if we go ahead to the next slide, how the different areas of the program standards for the PFA program, we've done that exercise, as Simon illustrated, of taking a concept that's in a program standard and then turning it into a cost. And so there's 3 different buckets of program areas, and we've got them across these 2 slides, starting with child and family. And I'll just quickly highlight a couple examples in here. So you see there's a couple things in this bulleted list of pieces that are baked into the cost model that are in non-personnel that support programs to meet that program standard of child and family experiences. So for instance, the food cost and the food supplies. That's a non-personnel expense in the cost modeling tool, as well as purchasing materials for an inclusive environment and supporting teaching and learning, the last bullet. Those are things that are going to show up as non-personnel expenses in the program budget and in the cost model. They support the program to deliver the child and family experiences that your PFA regulations are expecting of them. A few others here on the list you'll notice tie more directly to staff time. and they tie then to things like having more coverage so that the classroom teacher can do the screenings with children, can prepare for their lesson plans. Inclusion aids is a whole different component of staffing. Those are all things that tie more to the personnel area of the cost model, and they're going to show up in FTE, basically. They're going to show up as a proportion, and those directly relate to the salary scales. That's where you're going to end up getting a difference in cost, as the volume of FTE that you need to meet the regulations will drive your cost, and then how much you pay those people that you're paying as full-time equivalent is going to dictate the differences in costs that you may see. Similar, if we just go to the next slide, there are two other buckets, the provider experiences and supports, and then the operations. So the two other areas of program standards for PFA, and particularly in that provider experiences and supports, or the workforce supports, the regulations talk about things like release time for professional development, for meeting with a coach to support the quality of the teacher in their experience with the children. Those things in the cost model get translated again into hours of release time so that the teacher can be going to PD. There's a substitute or a floater or another teacher that steps into the classroom during that window, and obviously that has a cost to it. So that's how concepts like program standards become cost model, cost drivers in the tool. These are some of the types of assumptions that in the written report, the details around whatever the relationship is, how much release time for one teacher in a given month or an annual period, this gets all delineated in the assumptions in the written report. But again, many of these are very much tied to the idea of what do you pay people and at what salary or step level are those people. So if we go ahead to the next slide, over the course of these two, we're going to take a quick look at the two of the salary choices in the cost model and the two that were used for the outputs that we're sharing this morning. So the first slide is sharing with you the current salary scale and step level data in the cost model. So really, when we think about salary within the PFA system, it has two components to it. It has that first component of the hourly wages by step level and position. So if you're a director and you're at the highest step level, you see that that's going to be over $40 an hour, where if you're a teacher at the highest step level, you're going to be at $26.55 an hour. So there are different levels that individuals are at based on their experience, their education level, and then which position they hold within the staffing pattern. The other piece that directly relates to the calculation of salary in the PFA cost model is then the distribution of people across those step levels. Because clearly, looking at the step levels from 1 to 12, you see a significant difference in the hourly amount that someone would be paid. It becomes really important to know where are people across the step levels. We have to have that other variable, that other piece of data, because if we assume everyone's at step 1 to 6, it's a very different cost output than if we assume everyone is at step 11 in the highest range. We were able to pull data from the PEL team, from your actual programs, on the current distribution of staff across those step levels. So you really can't think about your salary without this step level piece, because of the fact that's critical to the idea of the quality of the experience and the education of the individual. And if you have a goal of folks moving up to higher levels on the step level, then you want to factor that into how much your salaries cost, because as you move folks up step levels, salary is going to go up as well. So this is the current option in the model, and we do have an output that we're going to look at later and juxtapose that against the second option of salary that we ran. There are a few other choices for salary in the model. There's even a user input where you could put in whatever salary you want to look at for the different positions. So we always have more options in the cost model around salary, and sometimes some of them never get used, because once a policy choice is made, you kind of move forward with thinking about that policy choice. And in the case of the PFA work, with having a salary goal, the PFA salary goal for 2030 is clearly a core piece of looking at where are you now under current salaries and where would your costs be if you move everyone to your goal salaries. And if we go ahead to the next slide, now you see the same format, but the data here is different. Some of it's significantly higher because they are the PFA 2030 salary goals, as well as PFA 2030 goals for step level. So, I mean, bottom line, it increases the average amount for a lead teacher per hour from about $30 to nearly $37 an hour. So, and that is the nature of a salary goal, right? We're increasing salaries, we're increasing people's qualification levels, and therefore we're paying them more because they've also increased their qualification levels. So these are the two salary options that when we move here very quickly, because I know this is sort of the meat of what we're here for, those initial findings, that we're going to be looking at how these two choices, current salaries versus your PFA 2030 goal, impact that bottom line of the cost per child output. And with that, I think we're going to move to results.
Yeah, so if we go to the next, if we go to the next slide, now we're going to share some of these results. And I just want to stress before we put these up that these are based on, these choice points in the model, right? So they're sort of a hypothetical. It's not one single program's budget. It is intended to reflect, the broad sort of range of providers in Multnomah County rather than one single. The true cost of care could be different for an individual provider, but this is intended to be a model to sort of share based on those assumptions. And just a reminder, as we mentioned a few times, it's a dynamic tool, so you can get other results out of it. So with that caveat, on to the next slide, we did run, as Gina said, two different scenarios in order to share with you some results today. They all meet the state licensing standards and PFA program standards. They all assume the program serves a mixed age of children, infants through school age, which is what we found to be the most common setting, and is clearly something that you sort of have prioritized by having the infant toddler supports as well, so that the preschool for all program doesn't harm the supply of infant and toddler care. So we sort of modeled that as a default sort of best practice. So the center-based scenarios we're going to show you are assuming a program with 4 classrooms, 1 infant classroom, 1 toddler classroom, 1 preschool classroom, 1 school-age classroom, which gives you a total capacity using licensing group size and ratios of 68 children. For the default family childcare scenario, we assume that it's a certified family childcare, which is, again, what we saw as being the more likely incidence of family childcare providers who are serving preschool for all children. And the assumption under that is that program has a capacity of 14 children, 5 of whom are preschool age children. So as we move to look at the results, that is the size of the programs, and then the 2 salary options we have are based on what Gina just shared on the last 2 slides. So if we go to the next slide, this is the outputs from the model, the true cost of care on an annual basis under those assumptions. And so just to sort of walk you through this, what you see up there is a set of results based on a full day, full year program, and a set of results based on the school day, school year program. And then the 2 sets of numbers within each sort of matrix are using those current salaries and current step levels. So with that average salary of a lead teacher of about $30, $31 an hour, or using your 2030 goal for PFA salaries and PFA step levels, which is closer to $40 an hour for a lead teacher. And what you see here is on an annual basis, the cost per preschool child ranges from $27,372 per year in a center for full day, full year using current salaries, up to $31,251 if you use that 2030 goal. If you're looking at in a family childcare based setting, it is a little bit less. It's $26,542 at the current salaries and $29,755 at the 2030 goal. Very similar numbers because the reality is they're very similar size programs within the preschool classroom, right? That family childcare is essentially 1 classroom is the way it operates with 14 children in. And of course, you've got a preschool classroom with just preschool children in there, but slightly less expenses on the family childcare side. For the school day, school year, you see the numbers go down somewhat, about $20,253 using the current salaries, $23,237 using the 2030 goal salaries in a center, and then $16,784 for a family childcare using the current salaries, and $18,798 using the 2030 goal. So just want to be clear that this is based on those assumptions, based on those choice points. There is some assumptions obviously made on school day, school year, specifically about, which expenses sort of exist whatever you're doing, right? The sort of a per child expense of sort of materials doesn't change that much, but food does if you're only feeding them for 9 months versus 12 months. There's some decisions around staffing there about, you don't need as much staffing to carry on if you're only doing a 6-hour day. So there's some differences there, but there's also a lot of expenses that still exist even at that school day, school year. And just to sort of help understand these numbers a little bit more, I want to go to the next slide, where we just sort of presented a sort of an example of how the assumptions we talked about specific to staffing pattern ends up showing up in the tool. Personnel is the largest share of expenses of running any childcare program. In this model, it comes out at around 72% of the total expenses are for personnel, right? So salaries and benefits. And of course, that's informed by both what you're paying people, which you have as a requirement, but also how many staff you have. So the how many staff you have becomes really important. And so what you see here is in our default scenario with 4 classrooms, 68 children, full day, full year, you need 12.2 full-time equivalent staff at a minimum to sort of run the program. And that's including the lead teacher and assistant teacher in every room. But then because the program is open longer than 40 hours, you do need additional coverage, additional assistant teachers to cover the open and close and breaks for the staff, because most programs are open. As a full-day program, you're usually open longer than 40 hours to accommodate families' work schedule. And then, of course, you need a program director, an assistant director, an administrative assistant. The model is dynamic, so the number of administrative staff goes up or down based on the number of children in the program. In this scenario with 68, we have 3 FTE there. And then, of course, additional coverage to cover paid time off. But then there are some additional staffing requirements related to meeting those PFA workforce and child support requirements that Gina shared earlier. Big one there is including inclusion aids. The model includes, under this scenario, there's about 1.7 FTE for inclusion based on that sort of default of 10% of children in the program needing support. But then there's also the model accounts for the release time for teachers to engage in those family engagement activities, family events, parent-teacher conferences, to engage in the required professional development and other additional professional development to keep current with the research in the field, to engage in coaching, to do lesson planning, review data from assessments, review curriculum data, and do child screenings. All of that is translated in the model into a cost through what is the time you need to do those and what is then the cost of a substitute to cover to allow that to happen. So all that ends up with another 2.62 FTE is what it totals up to. So you have over about 15 FTE in total managing this program. And so you start to see pretty quickly how you get to that cost per child when you're looking at 72% of the expenses being personnel, you have 15 FTE, and you have a required salary scale for them. And then just finally on the last slide, I think you all probably have a good sense of what the current PFA reimbursement rate is, but if we go to the next slide, we did just provide for comparison purposes what the annual gap is between the true cost of care numbers that were presented on a slide 2 slides ago and both the FY26 PFA payment rates and the FY27 payment rates. And I will note, apologies, I did notice there is an error on the slide in the top right-hand corner. That title should be school day, school year, right? So it matches the results slide that the first set of columns are full day, full year, the second is school day, school year, but in the very top right, that should actually say school day, school year. But what you see, and Rachel mentioned this earlier on, is that you were actually not too far away from where, certainly our experience in many states, you aren't too far away yet with your rates. You're about $2,300 per year per child using current salaries in a center-based program on a full-day, full-year schedule, and about $1,500 under the true cost of care in a family childcare home. So that means your current PFA rates in FY26 are covering about 91% of the true cost of care in a center and 94% in a family childcare home. And many states would be very happy with those numbers on their subsidy, but of course that is still room for growth there, right? You know, that if we're saying this is what the true cost should be, providers rightly want to see the numbers getting very close to that, if not meeting that. With your FY27 increase in rates, the numbers go down a little bit. As you can see on the bottom table there, your gap now on the center base is about $1,300, and for family childcare, it's only about $500 per year per child. I will note over there on the right-hand side, you'll see under the family childcare-based setting for the school day, school year settings, under current salaries, the model does actually show that what you are paying is sufficient to cover the true cost of care by about $750 in the family childcare school day, school year under current, and about $1,500 in the school day, school year with the FY27. You know, honestly, this is likely about the family childcare model is always the one with the biggest range because of how providers are, you know, their time space percentage. There's a lot of like business expenses that may be included or may not be included. You know, we also know you have very few family childcare providers providing school day, school year care. So, you know, our pool of providers to talk to sort of refine the assumptions in there could be slightly over or undercounting. But just did want to point out that there is two places there where at least under current salaries, your payment rate is exceeding the true cost of care. And so that's sort of the results. That's sort of what we have for you today. Obviously, as we've mentioned a few times, there's the ability to refine the modeling, to dig deeper into the assumptions, to look at additional assumptions, to run these numbers with different assumptions to inform that. But we did want to come to you with some results today so you could see under these assumptions what the numbers look like. And with that, we'd be very happy to take any questions you have.
All right, thank you all very much for for all of the information and the really great work that you've been doing to create these models. We'll open it up to the board for any questions. We can start with Commissioner Singleton.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you all for the work that's gone into this to date. I have a couple of questions. That's actually a little bit of a lie. I have a lot of questions, so we'll see how, I won't take all the time, but so I guess this one will be for PEL. I'm curious what advisory groups have been informed about some of this results that we've seen to date in the process to date, and what any feedback has been from those advisory bodies about this engagement process, if we're missing something, making sure that folks are being a part of this conversation.
Thanks, Commissioner Singleton. Denisa McLean, she, her pronouns. Yeah, so we actually had a conversation with our PFA advisory group related to the true cost of care and the process in which we were going to engage in the conversation related to community. We have not shared the results that was shared today. We intend to engage with them in the next advisory group to have conversations around the results and the report. But yeah, we have not shared the actual report with them yet.
And what about the newer provider advisory group?
The provider advisory group, I can get back to you because I wasn't a part of that conversation, but I'm sure probably our senior manager was probably a part of those conversations.
Okay, thank you. Have we gotten feedback from providers who engaged in either the input sessions or interviews on how this process has gone and if we've missed anything?
Again, sorry, Commissioner, this is Denisa McLean. We have actually engaged with a lot of our providers related to the listening sessions, a lot of positive feedback. Of course, this time of year is a really busy time of year. There are a variety of different modalities that were put into it. So we had surveys, listening sessions, as well as focus groups, and of course, one-on-one conversations with providers. We have not heard from providers with whom declined the opportunity to engage with us, but certainly that is a good touch point for us to circle back as we have more results to share.
Thank you. And I think it's just one, you all hear the same theme for me when we do engagement. We have to close the loop and actually go back to the people and say, this is what we heard, is this correct? So I just want to make sure we're doing that, closing the loop. You shared some data on that 65 PFA providers had been engaged. Is that unduplicated, so it wasn't the same provider who engaged in multiple things?
Yeah, this is Simon Wetman, and yes, that's correct. It was
Thank you.
Not duplicated.
And PFA folks, how many providers do we have in the system currently?
Over 300?
Okay, thank you. And do we have a sense for that the sample size is, or the sample that engaged here is reflective of the different demographics, some of our culturally specific schools, all of those components that I think go into what we look at for the bigger picture? I want to make sure, I know sampling is a thing that can be challenging, and want to make sure we're not just hearing from homogenous group of providers.
Yeah, Simon Wetman, this is something we're very conscious of in our engagement, of just making sure that we're doing outreach at the front end to all those different types of providers. You know, I don't have the direct numbers in front of me, but we did definitely get family child providers, center-based providers. We had some big providers who sort of, you know, had multi-sites, and then we had some small providers who are just individuals. We did do a number of sessions in Spanish to get the multilingual providers. In terms of the location across the county, I don't have that quite down, but we were very intentional about trying to make sure we reach those, and the same with the interviews, to make sure that we were sort of, if you would prefer to have an interview, to sort of directly talk to us.
Thank you. I'd love to just see that as follow-up. I don't need it today.
Commissioner, could I add one piece to that, just to touch back? One of the reasons, we'll say, for a relatively quick process, and the providers did have lots of other pieces of things going on at the same time, you got a strong turnout for 65 of 300 plus. We see places at like 10 to 15%, so that you got a strong turnout. We also knew that because there was so much admin data from all of the providers that are under contract with PFA, that we really have to think about the representation as that is a key piece of it. We didn't have to ask, if we only talked to 65, then that means 240 didn't answer the question on X, because we actually had some of those answers from admin data. So that gave us a more fully representative, because the data was from everyone through contracting.
Thank you. I definitely appreciate that. And I think one of my, and our PEL folks know this, one of my concerns is I'm not sure that we're actually where we need to be on inclusion supports. And so just using administrative data there has me a little bit concerned that we're going to still will be below cost of what it actually is to implement the program we want to implement. And so, hearing that it's about 10%, I heard you say, is the assumption of inclusion, 10% of the kids?
Yes, so we heard a lot from providers about the need for inclusion supports. We heard a lot of positive about the inclusion supports that are currently provided, but we also heard that there was a lot of need, that children didn't necessarily rise to the point of having the formal designation. And so the purpose of that 10% is to sort of say, we understand from everyone there is a baseline need of just inclusion supports in basically every program. And if you want to be welcoming to the child that comes in the door on day one, you need some supports there. There is separate need for the deeper inclusion supports that are offered through PEL as well. And so that 10% is just to account for that baseline, and then knowing there needs to be additional supports for the kids with high needs above that.
Okay, so that's when, is that going to be included in the cost modeling, or is that something that will
that's
keep
a
separate?
really key piece of this question with inclusion, that is that often this audience that is serving children with the most exceptional needs can be a very small audience, because they haven't received the support to be able to do it, and they're not necessarily represented in, lack of a better term, data collection. The cost modeling as a tool has the choice points to understand the cost of that, regardless of whether or not how many people you currently have doing it, and whether if they were compensated better, or there was better work on the mix of the different funding streams like Part C or Part B that could also be leveraged, what would the actual cost of the service be to those children that have those more more extensive needs and the cost. So the cost model can give us that cost output. It's not reliant on the provider coming to us and saying, because sometimes they don't even know how much it costs them because they're absorbing so much of it in their day-to-day operations, right? It's hard to enumerate in all instances.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. Oh, sorry, were you going to say something?
Sorry, Commissioner, just to clarify, we have 225 sites for 25-26, because that's where the data came from, and then 180 providers. Just to
Thank you.
clarify the number, yeah.
And to clarify again, the 65 is providers, right? So it's using that second number that Denise just shared.
Perfect. Thank you. I think as the report comes together, or as an adjunct to what you all are pulling together, we're still missing the mark on inclusion supports. I keep hearing from providers about the need there, and it doesn't mean the work that's happening isn't good. It just means I want to be careful of an outcome here where we get a cost model that doesn't actually meet the needs of the kids, and then we make financial decisions based on something that isn't really what's happening on the ground for them.
Thanks, Commissioner. I just will say, I don't think there's a situation where we no longer have inclusion support funds in addition to a rate. I think this is, again, just trying to level set around, like, there needs to be a baseline for all sites and to receive the adequate amount of funding for, to run their facility. But then we know there are sites that have a pretty significant number of children who have higher needs, so they would still need access to those inclusion funds, which may provide them the opportunity to have additional staff and support. And obviously, we know that this is still part of the process, and for good reason. Like, we're the first in the state to implement this type of policy, so we're in this process of continuing to learn and evaluate what we need, and we are grateful for the advocacy and support that you all have provided to ensure that we're doing that well. And so I think some of the things we've put in place this year are a step in the right direction. So again, thanks to both of you and all of you on the board for encouraging us, advocating and supporting and providing guidance, and listening to providers as they tell you different things than they tell us. So that's a helpful part of the story for us to incorporate into whatever we're providing. But I think this is, again, actually making it a better just general rate in terms of incorporating inclusion within the rate, and then also helping to support providers who do have that higher number of children who need support. So both and then obviously ongoing conversation about what else we could be doing.
So I'm trying to think of the public narrative here, and part of the challenge is if we're saying there's 10% of students assumed to need inclusion supports, but that's really about a baseline welcoming environment. It's different than the inclusion that we talk about, and so using the same term, I think, in the public narrative is going to be challenging. So I don't know if there's different language that should be used in what's included in the model, because when I read the slides and it says inclusion supports are in, or inclusion is in there, I'm like, oh, great, then we need to change this to make sure we get to the need that we have. And if it's not, that's fine too, but it is confusing in the public narrative, and I don't want, before we even had this briefing, there was already articles about this, right? And so I don't want the public narrative to be like, this is it, this is the max that we have to pay for everything, therefore you all should be making X, Y, Z decision, but really we actually need more inclusion support dollars somewhere else. So I want us to be careful about it and figure out how to message that appropriately.
Clarify what you're saying, just to make sure we understand. You're saying, because I think the way, Simon, you described it as inclusion supports for children who might not meet like a particular designation or meet what would be, we would typically fund for inclusion supports, and including a baseline of additional support for children that just might have higher needs but don't rise to that level, making sure we're not calling that the same thing. Is that what you're
Yes.
saying? Okay, I just want to make sure I understand.
Yes, and on the second slide, or the third slide that you all had, as the department, it says includes inclusion there, and so my assumption was it includes the more robust. Okay.
Yeah, you sort of need to go more education on the fact that inclusion is a continuum, and a
Yep.
child who maybe needs an hour of speech therapy once a week or once every other week is very different than a child with deep exceptional needs that needs assistive equipment in the classroom, right? Those are very different expenses as well, which we know that the model can do that, but I really appreciate your reference to the framing that you'd have to make sure that the audience understood that when we use inclusion, we mean inclusion included in as a baseline that is more at this lighter end, not to minimize it, because it's a huge step to include it in a rate, but that you also plan for a system that can include the further end of the spectrum, the much more expensive end. And so messaging around that, there's an opportunity there to try to do some education messaging that supports that education.
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you. I really appreciate that. Sorry, I know it was a bit of a winding road. I went all over the place. I think, so I'll hold my questions then, or let's just say them. It's something that we can follow up on later, but I'm curious about, last time we had a check-in, I think you all were going to send me what the process is for getting inclusion supports. So I just want to put a marker out. I'm still looking for that. I won't go down the other rabbit hole since that's a different conversation, but maybe we can have, I'd love to put another work session together that we can dig a little more into how we do inclusion and those higher end supports. And then, no, I'll hold that one for the inclusion conversation as well. So thank you. I guess I did only have a couple. Thank you all so much.
Great, thank you. Commissioner Jones-Dixon.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, PFA team, for the presentation, and Jana and Simon for being here. I don't have any questions. I'm just looking forward to looking at the final report. The information that you provided was extremely useful and helpful and educational as far as where we're at and the potential for the future. I personally have heard from PFA providers about just the level of care and the responsiveness and just the difference. So I'm extremely hopeful based off of the information that you provided this morning. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, Commissioner Moyer.
Yeah. Thank you for the presentation. That was very helpful. And thank you also for conversations we've been able to have and talk through some of the policy choices that we could discuss using this tool. And I think actually inclusion is a great one because it is what we decide it is. And there are really, hard conversations to figure out what is the role of PFA in inclusion, what is the role for state programs like early intervention, and some of that is like whose responsibility, but also their funding reality. And so I think we have to be a little bit honest that that's not enough. It doesn't necessarily mean it's our job, but it's a conversation. And also, this interplay of how ready do we want teachers to be is a training question, and that has, through this model, do they need time off? Do we have to pay for subs? It's a dynamic conversation that I'm actually excited to have this tool to have, because I think we have some tough thinking to do on how do we best support kids within a program that we can afford. The other question I wanted to talk about around this tool is, I think we have, you brought up some interesting things that kind of left me curious of, okay, based on, and this is a little bit of question for our department, and then also a question of what it would cost. I didn't realize that only 60% of our lead teachers had the AA that will become a requirement that 100% have in 2030. Getting 40% to an AA in 3.5 years is a daunting task. And I don't know if we've tackled what it would take to get there, but in this modeling, we don't address that issue. It's just, this is what it is and we're paying. So if we want to meet our own goal, I'm really curious about what options are out there that are feasible and what they would cost to get there, because that, again, to those watching, this is not the full cost of the program with our policy goals. And that is when I would say we don't currently have programming. Well, we do help people get their steps, and I am really glad that that's in there. But I don't know if we could say we help people get their AA. That's I think, a little bit more than our current, not a little bit, it's a lot more than our current educational support. So I think that that's a policy question that we as a board are gonna have to tackle, of like, if we want to meet that 2030 deadline, we will have to invest. And I don't know what the best mechanisms are, but I hope this tool can help us have this conversation of like, how do we get there with teacher education, and what are the tools that we'll need to do to get there. The other things I'm really curious about, again, are like some of the dynamic things at play, and what we might be able to do and might not be able to do around looking at policy options that might be beneficial for cost containment. Liability insurance was one that I'm interested, because I too have heard the feedback that has gone up really rapidly, and what could the county do to try to slow that growth over time. Health insurance is another one. And that's a difficult one, because our requirements are not, do not require the same quality of plan across the industry, and I think that's worth talking about. Some providers can offer it at very low cost to employees, others cannot. And we just went off of the cost, right? I assume you didn't say, well, everyone really should have a baseline plan of. So that's another thing that we might need to have a conversation about, is like, do we want at some point to say, the plans that are being offered need to be within an affordability range? Or could we pool? Or could we do, so there's these dynamic questions. And I guess my question for P5 is like, how do we have those kind of like exploring policy options with your tool? Like, if I wanted to look at health insurance and I wanted to like see your assumptions, see what's going on, manipulate what we might be able to do, how does that work?
Sure. I realize I didn't introduce myself each time. Gina Capito, Prenatal to 5 Fiscal Strategies. There's a few ways to go about it with the tool. Ultimately, the tool is, and we take health insurance, we take that discretionary benefit, that line. It is a lump sum. You have and that lump sum is coming from cost data related to what is the typical employer cost for health insurance in your state. So there is a data source for that is coming from the reality of the plans that are available, how much does the employer typically pay. That means that the employer could pay that much, but the plan could actually cost 4 times that, and the employee could be asked to pay the balance of it, which then there's a huge affordability question for, even at these higher salaries, that's still a huge affordability. So there's the opportunity to add more choice points in what that cost is, so that you could say, we expect that the plans on average cost $30,000 per employee, and the employer should always pay at least 70% of that. So you can add a few of more toggles to it, so that's not just the lump. You can add more lump sum amounts, but you could also add, and we built for other places where the tool includes what percentage the employee pays of it, so that you set a bar. The employee is not going to pay more than this of it, so that then you can see how that affects the cost when the plan goes up. So just a couple more toggles related to it. It does take doing some of that research on the side to understand what is the sort of the best value plan that is also not undercutting what the employee is getting access to. Oh, the cheapest plan is often literally the cheapest plan, is that, so really thinking about that value of, we want to offer people a plan that is a good purchase. And so then how much does that cost? And then how much of it do we pass on? How does the employer hold? How much do we pass on to the employee? You can use the tool to do those sorts of things, especially as you pull in the data on that cost value related to what's offered in your region.
Does your cost model look at the administrative side? So, if we are acknowledging that we want to have providers more prepared to be welcoming for students who experience any level of disability, there's obviously what it costs the provider, but then there's also, what does the department need internally to do that work? Does yours talk about that side, or is it purely provider?
I'll start out and you can jump in. Yeah, I'm still green. If you pass it through to the provider, yes, but that's not typical. So this is a direct service tool in the sense that it is telling us how much it costs for me, a family child care owner or a center-based director, to deliver the service. If we turn that into something that you pass me, the center director, the dollars to pay for the training to make a more welcoming, inclusive environment, then we could turn it into a direct cost. We could. But I still think we'd then be missing some key elements of the value that you have of having a local initiative, a local funded Preschool for All initiative with a local administering entity that is in essence at this is your system for this. And there's certain things that held at the system will be more efficient, because if every center director like Gina Capito had to go out and buy different inclusion training to make a welcome environment, it's going to cost more because we're all out there buying it separately. Also, the range of what we're buying could vary greatly. I might not care about that, and so I buy something that is just the bare minimum, but the system has set a standard, and if the system holds some of those resources that are about the idea of capacity and quality, then the system can push them out to all providers. Then the system holds the expense. And then you want a tool that is much more about what are the costs for the administrative entity? Is it about staff on that entity that are supporting the establishing the standard for that training? If we keep using that example, go out and hold the contract with the trainers, make the training available throughout the county. There's a lot of different ways it can happen, but ultimately it comes down to potentially more capacity at the PEL with that team, and then thinking about how they're managing those contracts and ensuring it's meeting the needs of providers. So it might also be a little bit of sort of what is the role of different team members. It's not just about administering a contract to a program, but it's actually about those system standards and the program standards that you hold as that system bearer. And that example of inclusion, and especially inclusion supports that should leverage other funding, our experience is that those other funding streams, Part B, Part C, Medicaid, can be very difficult for individual providers alone to suddenly strike out and become, I'm center-based director Gina Capito, I'm going to suddenly start billing Medicaid. I've never billed Medicaid in my life. I don't even understand it. Like it's unlikely to happen.
Yeah.
That's where your system comes into play, because you have this opportunity, you have capacity of people at your public entity to build the infrastructure for the billing of Medicaid, to engage a third-party biller. Doing that at that system level is so much more efficient and so much more likely to generate the revenue into the programs then, versus leaving it at each program having to do it. So and those things, to understand the expense of that, how many inclusion trainings do we need? You do more of a system level modeling to say there's 100 providers that need this resource, and when we hold it at the system, it can cost between this dollar amount and this dollar amount, and then you can do some budget projecting for what your system needs to look like in order to respond and to deliver the capacity supports. And I pulled out the revenue example because it's such a huge need when we think about the idea of bringing other funding into this mix for programs, especially around children with exceptional needs. But there's a lot of places where your system is the holder of the initiative and can do so much to then support the capacity of providers to deliver the service.
Great. Thank you so much.
And so if I can just add one to your workforce question as well, it can also help with that, right? That question of like, what does it take to get, you can build into that system model, okay, if we need this many providers, A, we're expanding, and then B, we need this many providers to have this many educators to be at that higher level. If you wanted to have an initiative that was sort of incentivizing providers to go get the AA or helping cover the cost, you can build into that, okay, we know that we need 20% of our lead teachers to get that every year, and we want to budget out for that, right? And then be able to adjust that. Like if it's gone higher or it's gone lower, you can change that. These dynamic tools can sort of be used. They're not meant to be just a one and done. They're meant to be enabled to be continuously updated, and that's the sort of work we've done in places like New Mexico that have been doing this on a statewide level to get to like the universal approach they're trying to do there.
Okay, any more questions?
If we wanted to talk about getting the system model, could we continue that conversation? Because I actually, these are some meaty things that I think is like our next phase of tackling, and so I just put that out there, then that would be wildly awesome, and maybe we should talk about it.
Yeah, I'm going to say we absolutely should talk about it.
All right, I'm done. Thank you so much.
Okay, great. Commissioner Brim Edwards.
Thanks for the presentation, and given my colleagues have asked a lot of questions already that sort of delved into some of the issues I was interested in, I'm just going to do my cleanup round. I won't re-ask. One of the things I was wondering, when you have all the inputs into the model, was there any data that you felt you needed that wasn't available?
I think this is Simon Whitman, Prenatal to 5 Fiscal Strategies. I think the one data point that is always really challenging is around occupancy expenses, because when you get current occupancy from providers, often what we find is that they are not necessarily paying like market rate for that occupancy, right? And that's part of there's been a gap in the resources for a long time. And so the providers who've made it work are often part of a larger organization who's covering some utilities and covering some costs, right? They're in a church building, a synagogue, et cetera. And so when you collect current data, there's a possibility that is sort of, adjusted down by some of that, right? If you are opening a new program tomorrow and are going to look and open and pay market rent, that's very different to what most providers are accounting for. And so it's also hard to get that data. So that's always just one that is, there's a huge range in there. So it's not necessarily that we couldn't get the data, it's just that the data that we do have is a huge range. And the providers who were often like, oh, how are you making it work right now? They're making it work because they're not paying the utilities or the rent or something right now. And again, it goes to, if you're looking for startup, what's the cost to start a new program? Then you should be counting for the market rate of rent, because you've got to open a new program. You can't expand significantly and rely on that in-kind support. But so that's the one data point I would say.
Gina Capito, I would add, and it's not so much about the current functioning of the model, but this bigger conversation of sort of the system in the future and expansion, especially because you have current salary data and you have salary goal data and step-level goal data. What we run into in implementing structures like this is the reality of the programs in attracting, finding the staff, not just hiring, but then retaining the staff, that they can find sometimes the individuals that on paper have the degree that they need. The hourly might look good to the person, but they don't want to work a full year position. They want to work a school year position, and this program doesn't. There's just a lot of data around the reality of, because so much of this is about the people and what will motivate people to move from step 6 to step 8. Sometimes we build initiatives and those initiatives don't get picked up. They're completely free college and scholarships to support childcare, everything and no one's using it within states. And so there's a lot of data around the why behind that, and that's about our workforce pipeline and how do we go from funding this because even in places where they're funding it nearly at the 100% and they still are running into those sort of workforce issues, that's a data point that is somewhat of a black box, and it may look different across different parts of your community. It often does across states, because rural versus urban. And so I think that's something to be thinking about for data. How do we ensure that we are having some of those qualitative conversations with providers about the reality of hiring and retaining, to make sure that some of the more system initiatives are being built in response to what they're experiencing. So it didn't keep us from having a strong salary-based model at this point in time, but as you think about your future, that'd be a data point that I wouldn't want to go too far without those deeper conversations with the folks that are hiring.
Thank you. Then on slide 14, there's just the increased cost of liability insurance. Was there anything in particular related to that?
Honestly, we've just been seeing that, we've seen that across the country, that insurers are pulling out of the market and are not providing child liability insurance to early childhood programs. A lot of them are not doing that anymore, so the market forces mean that the cost is going up amongst those. So we were able to get some data from First Children's Finance, who'd done some data collection with providers in Multnomah County that included PFA providers to actually get some hard numbers to put to that, but it is not unique to this county.
And may I add to that, Commissioner? Denisa McLean, Director of Preschool Early Learning Division. This year, the Preschool for All, or PEL, established a shared insurance pool with a provider to help support the liability insurance.
Great. Also on that same slide, there's the statement about funding not keeping up with pay expectations. And are those pay expectations that are stated programmatic pay expectations, or are they the general pay expectations that you have generally in the workforce, in which you have sort of a capped or a top step where people reach the top step and you're at the top step? So I'm curious which one you're referring to.
Simon Wetman, P5 Fiscal Strategies. Yeah, that is referring to the salary scale that has been established by Preschool for All, that when you are moving up on the step level in the Oregon Registry, that you are supposed to be paid more. And so we heard from providers saying, well, it's great my staff went and got higher credentials, but then they come to me and want a pay raise, and I need to give them a pay raise, yet the PFA rate has not gone up to account for that. Because it isn't a dynamic rate that's moving based on, the staff.
So they're actually, in theory, moving steps, for lack of a better word.
Yeah.
But the pay that's set is not meeting expectations.
I think that it wasn't so much the pay requirements are not, we didn't hear so much that the pay requirements are not enough to go and hire teachers. It was more that if you have a teacher and they move up a step, that then you don't have the money in your budget to pay them more because the rate didn't go up at the same time.
Okay, great. And there wasn't a bad answer to that. I was just curious about what it meant. Then on page 16, the modeling function, it says serving birth to school age, full day, full year, and school age. So we have a universal preschool program, which is, I'm assuming, what was in the model. What did you model for birth to 3?
In the sense of what, Gina Capito, Prenatal to 5 Fiscal Strategies, in the sense of the program, like what regulations they meet for birth to 3? Or what age, give me a little more on the question.
Well, so, I mean, the program is a universal preschool, so I'm assuming the model has 10 hours for 3 and 4 for all 3 and 4-year-olds. How did you incorporate, or using what set of assumptions for 0 to 3, because are they not included?
No, well, you have the option, and the scenarios that we gave you outputs for did include as if the program, so think of the program as a full day, full year program for all ages of children. So all ages of children in that program, with the exception of school age, because they become before and after, but for all children from birth to 5 in that full day, full year program, they are offered the 10-hour day and the 5 days a week, the full calendar year. So all of the children are receiving the full day, full year of services, which also then means the preschool age children are meeting the PFA regulations on the amount of time offered.
So it's universal childcare for 0 to 3, and then universal preschool.
It's more about the dynamic of the program, that most of your programs that receive the PFA contract are already serving the full age range. And so part of what you don't want an initiative like Preschool for All to do is, in San Francisco saw this in their early days of their PFA, where it actually drove some providers to say, well, I'm just going to serve preschool children because this is a great rate, and my infants and toddlers cost a lot more and I'm not getting covered for them, so they drop the age group. Part of what we're doing with modeling and including a program that retains their services to birth to 3 is modeling the full service. Your rate is for the cost output here is for the preschool child in that scenario. There is a different cost output for the infant and toddler in that scenario, which is higher than the preschool output because they cost more to serve. It is not saying that your rate would cover those children. It is instead saying that this program has 4 classrooms and the director is responsible for all 4 of them. Your rate pays for a portion of that director, and then hopefully other revenue sources pay for the other ages of children so that the complement is a true mixed age service being delivered to children.
Okay, great. Thank you for explaining that. Then, this is just a more sort of higher level theory program, because in 1995, the state, or 97, created the QEM, the Quality Education Model, which was, in theory, here's what it costs to educate through the K-12 system. And they had a whole bunch of assumptions about quality and length of the school year, and inclusion, and electives, I mean, just everything. And they came up with a number, like, here's what the Quality Education Model says the whole state number should be. And putting aside for a moment that they never got to the QEM, but if you looked at what was in the QEM and that what local school districts were doing, it wasn't, even if they'd had the full amount of the full QEM, there wasn't actually a connection or any sort of accountability. Like, if we gave you the full QEM amount, you would agree to have, class sizes of less than 25 and, 200 instructional days a year, all those things. So is this true? So say we come up with the true cost and we've got lots of inputs, and I think you actually have less inputs than QEM, which makes it easier. But how, from other programs, how would you know then if you have, like, here's the true cost, here's the big sum of money, that then that's what you're actually buying? Sorry, that was a long question, but.
No, we get this question all the time.
Yeah, Simon Workman, Pre-5 Fiscal Strategies. Yeah, that's a great question, because ultimately, right, as good stewards of public money, you'd say, okay, if you're getting this, are we getting what we expect out of it? I think, it's always a balance between, I think having the pay requirements that you have is really key. There are places that don't have pay requirements, and then we're building in an assumption in the model of pay, and then how are you guaranteeing that money is actually flowing through to the teacher, right? And not necessarily that providers are sort of pocketing it themselves, but they're spending it on other expenses, right, and not getting through to the workforce. Our recommendation in those places would be have pay requirements. You have pay requirements. You have the requirement to put in data every year, and you could hold people accountable to it. Now, that is, as I think we mentioned, 72% of the cost of running a program is based on personnel. So, you could say that, okay, if this true cost number is this, you could hold to the pay requirements. You could also hold to that percentage and talk about saying, we actually want to make sure that you are showing your budget that at least 70% of your budget is going towards personnel expenses. I think where it gets a little difficult is, like, the model has line items for everything, right? And if you were holding people to, well, we said there's $120 per child for office supplies, are you paying that, right? That's very difficult. Every program is slightly different. So, I think our recommendation and sort of our advice when we've worked in other places is to really focus on the biggest expense, that is that personnel, and sort of let the programs have the autonomy to manage the rest of their budget sort of as they see fit, that fits within their own their own marker. Now, there are other ways, like your PFA standards right now have a lot of things listed but without numbers next to them, right? So paid planning time is a requirement, but there is not a requirement about the number of hours of paid planning time. There are some places where the regulations will say explicitly you must have at least 1 hour per week of paid planning time. That is something you can consider. The model has about, I think it's 1.5 hours for a lead teacher and 0.5 hours for an assistant. If the cost model's including that, you could choose to put that in and say that is a requirement and have them keep to that. So there are some ways you could sort of tighten up some of the requirements to align with the model assumptions.
Okay, great, thanks.
No, I'll just add on that the additional reg outside of even, the other, say, 28%, the sort of the balance between the personnel that Simon just outlined and then sort of the rest of an organization's budget, some of those things have parameters that come from licensing. Licensing for both family child cares and centers has a requirement of space per child. So there, yes, you could be in an occupancy situation where you have a dollar lease for 30 years with a church, sure, but the hope is that then that program is likely, and this is what we hear from programs, they're using that benefit to other things, or they pay a lot of money in utilities because church buildings aren't, necessarily the best with their HVAC. Like there's some other way, and that's a requirement. You have to have the space. You have to provide food to children, and there's a certain cost to it. So when you think about the balance of say 28 to 30%, and that some of these other things to actually operate this type of service are those non-personnel items that they're going to have to expend, it's not actually a huge amount left that they have. That they could just be using it for anything that's far outside of what your hope is for it, that it's actually pretty tight parameters around it once you have the salary requirement and you hold accountability to that. That's the biggest one that we find places struggle with. There's no salary requirement, yet you're paying them 80% of the true cost of care. Then how do you know where that 80% goes if you don't ask them to hit a certain measure of salary for staff? So you've already kind of cleared that hurdle as far as accountability.
Great. Thank you. That's super helpful. And then just my last question is, and this is maybe for your team. Sorry, if the providers are not at capacity, say that at 80% capacity or 82%, but are being paid at the 100% rate, where does the money go? Because we're not actually paying on our model pays on a 100%? Or
Hi, Commissioner Denisa McLean, Preschool and Early Learning Division Director. I have a clarifying question. Are you talking about the seat rate, like that allocated amount that we pay per contract? Is that what you're asking about in terms of thresholds?
No, so I'm assuming the model assumes that you have like a full classroom. And based on that model, there's a cost for the staff. If you have fewer students than, it's like in the K-12 system, it's per student. So if you have fewer students, you get fewer staff. And this model, it's not connected. So do you just have smaller class sizes, or curious, since the money doesn't follow it, but we're funding like the full cost. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it's a Rachel, are we doing this every time? Rachel Pearl, DCHS Director. I think it's a complicated question that I do think we're going to be diving more deeply in with you around. I think what you're speaking to is enrollment, and if perhaps there's some seats that at a particular site that are currently unfilled. I think the challenge around having that conversation around staffing levels, just because there's 1 or 2 less children doesn't mean that the staffing ratio changes. So I think that it's more complicated than like a simple answer. I think, and so I think in terms of enrollment and our policies, which is something that we're very interested in and very strategic about right now, and having more conversations with you all about that. I think that we could talk about some scenarios, and if that's something that would be of interest, come back and talk about like if this, then this, and this is what that would look like, if that would be helpful. Because I understand what you're asking, and I don't think it's a simple answer.
Okay, we can talk about more in depth when we talk about
Commissioner, just
enrollment.
to say that the model can go with less staffing, but it is about that idea of what is the relationship of the teacher or teacher assistant to the number of children. So you could run a scenario where if a program was only 50% funded on their capacity of 16 slots, what would be their staffing? And to understand that, right, to the director's point, there is a point where you could have one less child and you still have all the staff and basically all the expenses except for, and really you probably have the food for that child too, because they might come to school that day, right? So you really don't see like a huge savings when it's one or two children under-enrolled or not showing up. But if there's a drastic difference of enrollment, you could actually model that to understand how, how expensive it is or how much the change in what the program should be compensated for could be. Yeah, you could look that way.
Thank you. So I have a couple questions, mainly on slides 24 and 25, which are about looking at the differences between center and family-based care, and then some of the staffing requirements. So I'm trying to understand how the required staffing for a center impacts the cost for preschool for all, which, like, were you considering like some of their administrative needs and their staffing needs around having a center? Is like Preschool for All partially subsidizing some of those administrative costs? Or I'm just curious for slide 24, like how does the required staffing level for a lot of these other positions, because they have infant toddler care, because they do school age care, because they have, how that fits into the cost estimates for that versus just the kind of straight preschool, understanding that we have infant toddler care, that there are some other, costs associated with just running something, but just curious about that.
Yeah, Simon Whitman, P5 Fiscal Strategies. Thanks for the question. Yeah, I mean, there is an assumption that because the way we modeled this particular scenario was that the Preschool for All is existing within this larger program, right? That you have to have a director, but if you just had a one preschool classroom, right, that cost with that one director, the whole of that one director would be sort of assigned to that preschool classroom. We sort of have a methodology in this that sort of says how many of those non-teaching staff do you need based on a program size. So, you talk to some programs and they only have a 50% assistant director, like a part-time assistant director, a part-time administrative assistant, and maybe in a 68-child program, you could get away with that director, maybe the assistant director is at sort of 60%. So sort of the way the PFA shows up in this is that what we heard from providers was that some of the requirements of PFA related to contracting and enrollment and keeping up with the standards meant that there was sort of administrative time that needed to be spent on that. And that is where, so for a 68 classroom, we felt like just having 2 FTE total would not be enough, that you need that 3 FTE to be kind of keeping up with that. So, you can run the model with just sort of run it as a preschool program, and we ran some scenarios with just sort of 2 or 3 preschool classrooms only, right, to try and sort of isolate that. Honestly, part of the reason we didn't share those results with you today was because they aren't that different. Because part of the economies of scale you get of having sort of 68 kids, doesn't really, you don't get that economies of scale when you go down to the smaller numbers of just, 2 preschool for all classrooms, for instance. So, you can, there is a question there of, we have assumed as well, the 4 assistant teachers, right, is, those are covering those other classrooms. We, within the model, do a sort of a cost allocation to each classroom and each child to say what are the costs that are specific to PFA, what are the costs specific to that preschool classroom that are going into there, right? What are the costs to infants? Because clearly, an infant, you've got only sort of 8 infants in the classroom that are taking the cost of a lead teacher and an assistant teacher, whereas in a preschool classroom, you've got sort of 18 or 20 preschoolers to do that. So there is sort of a way that the amount gets put in. Same with sort of on the right-hand side, the sort of family engagement activities is based on the number of children, and that gets allocated proportionally. So the preschool classroom is sort of taking the more cost there.
Okay. And then I was just curious, did you consider pay equity? Like, I know that's a big impact for providers as well in terms of, whether it's a preschool classroom or not, when you pay somebody something in Oregon, there has to be pay equity.
Yes, we did. One of the things we actually asked providers in input sessions a lot was like, how do you staff this? Are you paying your preschool classroom teachers, the preschool for all salary requirement, but if they're a preschool promise classroom next door, paying them something different, or a toddler classroom? And most of them told us they pay the same because the equity across the program just doesn't make sense. So that is what we modeled. We modeled the infant toddler teachers getting the same. The model includes the ability to not do that, to pick a different salary for that. To that point of it's dynamic and you can choose different things. But all the numbers we shared today do have pay equity across the program.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. This was a really a great presentation. I want to appreciate again all the work that you've done. Thank you to the PEL and DCHS staff for all your work on this as well. This board has a lot of work to do this summer, in thinking about this. So we're going to have more conversations. July 21st, we're going to have a PFA work session where Jeff Renfo is going to walk us through the modeling tool, as well as some financial scenarios that were requested from some of the board offices. So we're looking forward to continuing this, but this is a really important way for us to start off that conversation. So thank you so much. That concludes today's board briefing. Our next meeting is scheduled for Thursday, July 16th at 9:30 a.m. There being no further business, we are adjourned.